I'm Reverend Dr. Terry Gallagher. I've been with you guys before. You might not remember me, so I'll tell you. Remember, I'm the guy with the strange background, all right? So originally I was an engineer, and I was a plant manager in the chemical industry for 32 years before I took this strange turn in the ministry. So for the last 15 years, I've been a minister and now a public theologian. My ministry is sustainingcreation.org, which is totally focused on environmental justice. So as my wife would say, I'm the environmental guy, if you just want to keep it short. Just a plug for my website, sustainingcreation.org, which has a ton of different resources that's free for your use. But let's get going. The scripture today is amazing in how it coordinates with this time, this crisis that we're in, because the scripture is entirely about people responding to crises. What do I mean by that? Well, we have that strange reading from the book of Acts, right? We have the killing of the man who is simply trying to proclaim that God calls us to live a different way. So the very first martyr in the Christian church, we have it documented in the book of Acts. And so obviously there was a crisis for him into how much of the truth should he proclaim versus the risk on his death. And then there's the crisis for the people who were hearing it, the crisis of what is enough justification to murder someone. For a crowd to descend to pick up stones and plunge somebody into death for something that they've said. And then we have the crisis of Saul. You notice at the closing, Saul is holding their garments. Because you want to hold your garments because when you're throwing the stones, it's bloody, and the bloody splashes all over the place. And so you don't want to get your garments dirty with that blood. It doesn't come out. And so Saul held the garments. And there's that last line which I pulled in from the 8th chapter, 1st verse, which says very starkly, and Saul approved of their killing. Remember that. We're going to come back to it. But also in the gospel reading today, we have another crisis. We have the crisis of Jesus is trying to prepare his disciples that he's going to soon leave them. Now you got to realize from a disciple standpoint, this is the worst thing you ever possibly want to hear because you just got him back. You just recovered from Good Friday. You just got Jesus back and now he's talking about leaving. And so you have the crisis of the disciples that are going to have to try and proclaim the good news when there's already a Christian disciple that's getting murdered. So do you risk that and get murdered too? But also the crisis of how are you going to carry on without Jesus in your life? And what's the overall message from Jesus in that? Is you know, I've been with you. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Or for me, personally, the way I use that scripture is to transform it into Jesus came to give me the truth about the way I am to live. Let's get into crisis. The crisis of the scripture readings as compared to the crisis we're in. Now, you know, a couple months ago, none of us were planning on this. None of us had anticipated this. And probably, I saw a meme the other day that the very worst action that we took was to buy 2020 calendars. Because whatever we wrote, you could just throw out. Because we don't know where 2020 is going. This pandemic has affected every aspect of our lives. It's a crisis. It's a crisis on so many different levels. But crises are also an opportunity. They're a danger, a risk, but they're also an opportunity. What are they an opportunity for? They're an opportunity to question your life path, to question whether you needed to redirect it, to question what I call the balloons, the baubles, and the bubbles. Bubbles, baubles, and balloons. What do I mean by that? Well, you know when you have a baby or a toddler, how fascinated they are with bubbles, right? They just get all excited and they glee, and then the bubble pops and they cry. And so you got to make more bubbles. And they get all happy and glee, and then the bubble pops. And until you run out of soap bubbles, you're caught in this rhythm, this almost addiction of, I got to create more bubbles to keep everybody happy. Why? Well, because in our life, we get all concentrated on baubles. What are baubles? You know what baubles are. Baubles are things that we place value in, which in hindsight don't have any value, or any lasting value, or any true value. Do we do this a lot? You bet we do. We do it in response to all of the different advertisements. We've got a multi-billion-dollar industry of renting storage units to store all of the baubles that we've accumulated. And if you've ever downsized in your life, you realize you've come to the point where you've got to discard some of those. So on a very personal basis, the idea of what is valuable that suddenly poofs into no value at all is what I call personal bubbles. Economists use the term bubble financing or bubble times when the basis for the environment, the basis for the finances just goes pop. On a society level, our bubbles are really more like balloons. And what do I mean by that? Well, they're more resilient. They last more than a few seconds. Some of them last a century or so. They can be patched. They need a lot of stuff pumped in them to keep them inflated, but eventually they wear out so much they just go pop and they explode. And just like the toddler that came across the bubbles with it popping, the youngster that comes across his balloon popping or jumping off into it also busts into tears, and so do we. In a time of crisis like the pandemic, we encounter our own bubbles where we wonder if what we've invested our life in what we have valued really is any value. And look at the time and the resources that we have wasted going after those baubles that in this time, they don't have any meaning. We have the silly bubbles, right? So one of the silly bubbles that we have is, well, on a personal basis, groceries. We're used to being able to go to grocery stores on demand, picking anything we want. In fact, in my neighborhood, we have 4 different stores to choose from. So if one doesn't have it, the other one does. And if the one that you normally do doesn't use it continuously, well, they've lost your business. Now you got to schedule a time to go pick up your groceries if you want to pay attention to social distancing. And so I have to schedule my grocery pickup 5 days in advance or a week in advance, right? And then you have the thrill of watching online as they pick or they substitute or they come across that they no longer have what you thought you had ordered. And don't get me going about toilet paper, that bubble went pop, huh? But there's also much more serious bubbles on a personal basis. The time that we got so involved in things that we lost track of the ones that we ought to be in deep relationship with. So, this Mother's Day, there's a lot of moms that aren't going to be there and grandmas that aren't going to be there because the virus has taken them. And there's a whole host of other ones that you're not going to be able to hug because you have to do it between glass. And we have the horror. I've seen the videos of the mass burials. That island in New York City where they stack the coffins 4 deep and 6 across and hundreds down a line. And the inability to actually have a funeral, to get together, to grieve. The bubbles that are popped give us an opportunity to ask if we have used the best of the time and the resources that God has given us that are no longer available because of this pandemic. But it also gives us that opportunity on a societal basis. On a society basis, the pandemic is pausing the economy. The pandemic is calling us to move into isolation. The pandemic actually is improving the environment because we have shut down a lot of the pollution things. So from an environmental justice standpoint, there's a brief reduction where people can breathe easier. Right? But it's much more than that. There are great injustices in our society, and the pandemic crisis gives us an opportunity to examine whether those balloons that hold those injustices because of our perceptions should be allowed to continue. There's injustices, like I said, in environmental. There's injustices also, though, in wealth disparity, in race, in sex, in criminal, in guns. Which of those ideas should still be valid in 2020? Or should we take this opportunity to question those, to change those, to come to a different way to live? Remember, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Or as I put it, Jesus came to show us the truth about the way we are to live. But I look at all of the injustices, and what stands out for me as a root, as the basis from which these injustices build, is their individualism. In fact, in our society, we've gone into hyper-individualism, where we don't know how to live together. I can tell you, as the board president of a condo association with a condo complex, we don't know how to live together. But you can see that every day with the disagreements, with the emotional polarity. We don't know how to live together. And then you've got the terrorizing moments where people are so fixated on their individual rights, they'll come out and insist, using armed military arms, that they have a right to live without restrictions, even if it costs the death of someone else. Which of these bubbles, which of these balloons, should we take this opportunity and examine, is that how God would have us live? Is that really what we're called to be? Where is the church in all this? What is the role of the community of faith? You know, here I am preaching to a bunch of empty pews, but I see all your nice pictures out on it. Where is the role of the faith community? And I would like to suggest that our primary role as a community of faith is to teach people how to live in community. That is where we have woefully gone wrong in the last 60, 70 years. As a community of faith, as a church, we have not broken through the societal barriers that are wrecked around our hyper-individualism. What does it mean to live together? It means to live a life based in compassionate love rooted in justice. How do we know that? The gospel. Again and again and again in the gospel, Jesus says, love God, love neighbor, love yourself. And that's not an emotional love, that's a sacrificial love. That's what we're called to be. You remember that line from Acts where Saul approved of the killing? You remember that? Saul eventually came to realize he was blind. He was blind to a way of life. And the only way he came out of that blindness is there was a Christian disciple by the name of Ananias who came and touched him and showed him what God would have him live. That is the role of community faith. That's our role. To show people how to live in community. Churches have made the mistake of embracing individualism, where we have tried to tailor messages and services to appease every single individual. And church is not about the individuals. Yeah, for pastoral needs it is, but as a community, as a faith justice community, it's about living together, embracing the values that God would have us live. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Our primary role is to carry that message forward to our community. To be that difference in a society that is bent on hyper-individualism to the point we don't care if somebody else dies so I can live free. The church has to be the voice that says, no, that is not what God calls us to be. The church has to be a living example of what it means to live in community, how we care for each other, how we care for the injustices of the world, how we stand as a living example of what it means to love God, to love neighbor, to love self. Can we do this? At the end of the pandemic crisis, which the best guesses now are years in the making, where will we be? Well, some churches are going to no longer exist. They won't. Sometimes through no fault of their own. But the churches that will, I truly believe, will embrace this calling to be a visible sign of the gospel message in our society that so desperately needs it. And so that's my message for you today. To live the gospel, to understand that crises are both a danger and an opportunity so that we can change, and to embrace change so that the gospel is lived. May this be so. When the pandemic is over, may it find us living in a community. May it find us embracing not selfishness, not hyper-individualism, but compassion and love. This coming week, may you find a way to be an example of love to those that you meet, whether it's on social media or just in a phone call or in a writing. May God bless us and guide us in this effort this day and all days. Amen.